Monaco and the streets of Monte Carlo, where things have got a little bit weird. That is a huge amount of stuff to get stuck into, which is exactly what we're about to do. Coming up on Tech Talk this week, we take a look at whether Red Bull has gone to the dogs, whether McLaren has skewered its aerodynamic department, and, well, I just get into a complete muddle about what's going on down at Mercedes. But first, we need to take a look at the Monaco circuit itself. It's the slowest track in Formula One. In fact, it's so slow in terms of its average speed that the race distance is actually shorter than any other track on the calendar, because the cars wouldn't complete 300 kilometres in the allotted 2-hour window that every Grand Prix must be completed in. So the track itself is the real driving force behind some of the designs you've seen over the years, and particularly this year on the cars. Because it has such a low average speed, you can add lots of downforce onto the car without worrying too much about the aerodynamic drag penalty. And that's why we like to call it lots of big dirty downforce. And that's why over the years you've seen crazy tower wings, double wings, wings on stilts, and wings on all sorts of different things. And 2026 is almost a little bit of a revival of that approach. The 2026 technical regulations feature active aerodynamics where the front and rear wing open, and it's a bit like the old DRS system of the past, and that's been a feature of Formula One for many years now. However, in 2026, things have changed a little bit for Monaco. The teams have known this for some time, that active aero would not be activated at all at the Monaco Grand Prix weekend. There would be no straight mode sections anywhere around the lap. And that left the teams with a little bit of a question mark. And the strange things you're seeing on the cars are the team's answers to that question mark. Now, this is the McLaren wings on a skewer. I'm not going to give them all silly names. You've got 5 different aerodynamic elements sticking up out of a reshaped rear wing. You can just see this little bulge in the centre line of the car here with those wings on a stick behind it. Now, what's happened here is with no active aerodynamics fitted to the cars don't need the active aero actuator, or the old DRS pod as some people still call it. Once you've removed that, you still have the freedom in the regulations where you're allowed to have a bunch of bodywork, which essentially is the shroud around the DRS pod actuator, or the active aero actuator, where you can sort of do what you like. And, well, McLaren has done this. This is, by regulation, the shroud over the active aerodynamics actuator on the rear wing, except there is no active aerodynamics actuator. But removing the actuator also raises a slightly separate non-aerodynamic factor. The cars are really limited in terms of their overall weight in 2026, and don't forget, weight distribution is also strictly set. If you remove an actuator, a mechanical device, from the highest point at the rear of the car, that's going to affect your weight distribution quite significantly. Even if it only weighs 200 grams, that's 200 grams you're going to have to think about at the front of the car, where of course there is another set of actuators and linkages. If you remove that, then you need to be thinking about the minimum weight of the vehicle overall and how that's affecting your weight distribution. If you want to keep that ideal weight distribution that you've been focusing on all season long, and you remove these elements, well, you need to put some weight back into the car. On the nose of the car and around the front wing, that's pretty easy. It's right at the front of the car. There's plenty of volume in that part of the car, and you can also put weight into the front wing. But at the rear wing, it's a different story. You don't really want to put a lot of ballast into the rear wing main plane, and it's not really designed for that. But what you could do is whack on a bunch of winglets to take up some of that free weight and that rules freedom. So that's exactly what the teams have done, and they have come up with some absolutely mind-boggling different devices in this area, and they're all generally designed to generate a bit of downforce with different levels of complexity. McLaren's design is... it's the work of something, isn't it? That is the work of madness or the work of genius, and sometimes the line between the two is a little bit blurred, it's fair to say. However, let's get down to the team that actually started this whole trend, and I think we can call it a trend. It's Alpine, and this isn't actually a picture taken from the Monaco Grand Prix weekend. This goes all the way back, I think, to Suzuka, where this picture was taken. Alpine, on their active aerodynamics actuator, realised at the rear of the pod here, there was a little bit more freedom that they could play with. So they decided to add this extra box winglet onto the rear with a couple of end plates and even a little gurney across the top of it. Generate a little bit of downforce. A lot of other teams would have taken a look at that and gone, That's a pretty clever idea. Let's have a look to see how Alpine's device works on our own car, in CFD and in the wind tunnel. And, well, it does work. And of course, Alpine has the biggest amount of CFD and wind tunnel time available to any team at this point of the season, though that is about to change. And we'll come back to that in a future episode. For Monaco, Alpine have modified their actuator to this specification. It's pretty much a continuation of the same theme. However, from the look of it, Alpine's actuator still remains inside the now elongated pod on the rear wing. You can just see it popping down here. So they don't need to put any ballast in, but they have revised the shape of that winglet on the back. You can see it's a bit longer at the rear and the end plates are much bigger. They've also added, and it's not really been picked up because it's quite hard to see them, two smaller little aerodynamic elements either side of that connecting point. So a lot of detail gone in there from Alpine, who had a head start, it's fair to say, compared to everybody else. One team, though, that might have just looked at the office pet, and office pets are usually a good idea, is Red Bull Racing, who took inspiration, by the look of it, with this. Now, I've heard this referred to as an Airedale dog. I like that one. Alex Brundle thinks this is a Norfolk Terrier. We've done some research and we think he's wrong. We think it is an Airedale dog. To be honest, the wind tunnel doesn't care about animals and comes up with all of its own shapes anyway, but pretty interesting design. It does look like, while Red Bull still has linkages within this whole design coming out of the rear of the dog, the linkage isn't a movable one, though there are some cables going in. I don't think this is the active aerodynamics actuator in here, it's just some additional wings, 3 separate wings. Everybody's looking at the head of the dog, the tail of the dog, but probably missing out this little tab on the centre line of the rear wing, following Ferrari's lead there a little bit as well. And they're not the only team to follow Ferrari's lead. I don't know though, because in some angles it looks to me more like a startled cat. What do you think? I hate giving silly animal names to bits of racing car. It's a really interesting piece of aerodynamics, so we shouldn't belittle it by giving it animal names. And it looks like a cat. This is so much fun. Just another angle here of the Red Bull design. You can actually just see on the trailing edge, you can see just a little opening at the rear underneath that upper winglet section. It's pretty similar at the front, so really huge detail. But with the scale of these are quite narrow parts, and if you scale this down to 60%, putting something like this in the wind tunnel really requires some precision engineering on the parts. Just think about the wall thickness of these end plates, and if you scale it down to 60%, you really are playing around with some fine 3D printing technology there. Some teams, I suspect, will not have put these designs into the wind tunnel, will have developed them purely in CFD and tried it out on the real car, because it is quite a fine piece of engineering to do it. Other teams, having looked at this solution, and you can see how narrow the leading edge of this Red Bull design is. Now, Red Bull have clearly got some pedigree in the aerodynamic development department, particularly when it comes to CFD, and I do wonder if they've just tried to reduce the frontal area of this supporting structure. You can see it's almost like a knife edge on that leading edge. Well, Audi is a perhaps more extreme variant of that. They still have an element in the location that you'd expect to see the active aerodynamics housing, and you can see how it's a pretty simple design. It's just a vestigial connector which sort of meets the requirement of the regulations. It's not helpful that Audi's logo is in yellow there, but I'm not going to change the colour of my virtual link here. But they've also added one of these Ferrari style tabs, but it's taller than the Ferrari element and also is a split twin element design, whereas Ferrari only has a single element design, and we will come to Ferrari. So Audi's just trying to reduce the aerodynamic impact of the actuator housing. What does this do? Well, you're removing a little bit of blockage in the centre line of the rear wing. Will it have an aerodynamic influence? Yes, but not enormous in terms of this element here, because the wing's designed around that. But removing it essentially gives you a little bit more upper wing surface, though actually it's the underside of the wing that does a lot of the work. From a different angle here, you can see someone taking a very close look at it with their sunglasses, but you can see the twin element shape of the Audi winglet at the rear, very vertical at the end there. Audi also has taken a different approach at the front of the car. Audi is one of 2 teams on the grid that has twin outboard front wing actuators. With no actuators in force at Monaco, they've simply removed them, but have left the linkages on either side of the car. But they have removed the blisters or the pods that you normally see on the front wing. There they go. Well, again, that has the same effect, removing a bunch of bodywork from around the wing surface, trying to get more airflow over the wing, get a bit more downforce for free, essentially. So that's the Audi approach. Down at Williams, though, things have been a little bit different. Williams does have an active aero actuator fitted to its car in Monaco. It's the complete actuator. I've gone back and checked. It's the standard design they normally run, and it looks like Williams have missed a trick perhaps, or just opted not to pursue this direction with their Monaco package, and I'm a bit surprised by that. There's some interesting detail, as there always is on a Formula One car, but actually you can see this is just their standard package that they run at every other race. And they're not the only team to run with what is probably their standard package. Ferrari is another team to have gone down that route. Now, we're used to seeing Ferrari without an actuator pod in the centre line of the wing here. That's because Ferrari's moved their actuators out to the wing end plates in these bulges on the edge of the rear wing end plate, and that's because they have that flippy over rotisserie wing, call it what you will. Obviously that's not in force for this weekend, so the question is, does Ferrari still have the actuators in the wing end plate, or have they just replaced it with ballast? Personally, I'd replace it with ballast. There's just one less thing to go wrong with the car, isn't it? Though they do have good reliability. Though Ferrari are continuing with this little tab that they've had in the centre line of the wing for the last few races, and that's probably what they're going to go with. Ferrari then not pursuing this specific area particularly hard. However, looking at the Ferrari wing, I thought I saw it before, because this is pretty similar, isn't it? Cadillac's new wing looks an awful lot like the Ferrari rear wing. Now, Cadillac and Ferrari share a power unit. There's a lot of crossover between those two teams. But Cadillac has also adopted this centerline tab, just like Ferrari's, though it's on a little bit of a stalk, which Ferrari's isn't. We can get a slightly closer look at it here. You can see that little stalk coming up from the bottom, and the very bulged lower section of it, and the very flat upper section and the gurney along the top. But looking on the outboard elements, Cadillac's also been copying Mercedes' homework, because they've got these additional tabs on the outer extremity of the wings. And if you look at it from behind, you get a nice look at what the design really is all about. And you can see there's just a machined metal section with just these little linkages in between. Two separate elements that are not quite connected, and I think that's by regulation. One's part of the end plate, and one's part of the wing structure. And again, exploiting a little bit of a zone of freedom in the regulations that I'm not entirely sure if the regulations fully intended to be there. But be there it is, and it is very much indeed there. But something else on the Cadillac wing that's maybe got me thinking. Remember those active aerodynamics actuator housings on the Ferrari rear wing here? Well, does Cadillac have something similar going on down here? I'm beginning to think maybe they do. And is this a hint that Cadillac also has a brand new rear wing to come with a new active aerodynamic system where the wing rotates just like Ferrari's? Well, we won't find out in Monaco because they're not using it. Racing Bulls, though, they have a device clearly that's added to the back of their active aerodynamics housing. It's similar to some we've seen before, but they clearly do still have the actuator in that pod, so no worries about the weight distribution there. However, I wonder, like Alpine, are we going to see this device, this more simple device, at a few races down the road? I think we probably will. I think at Racing Bulls, clearly low drag variant of the active aerodynamics housing, but that's allowed. Some team will have a Spa and Monza version for lower drag, and then a slightly bigger version for the rest of the circuits. And it looks like they found a little way to integrate that quite nicely. Another nice little detail on the Racing Bulls version, the two little additional elements either side of the linkage at the centerline of the rear wing of the car. Now, here's one I don't understand as well. It's the Haas. Now, if you look at the actuator housing, it's quite different to what Haas normally run, but you can still see it's got the actuator in the underside. The mechanism's still inside that pod. But they also have this wing section on the trailing edge, much like Alpine. But unlike Alpine, it's quite interesting to see where the airflow comes from, because it's not coming from in front of the car, I don't think, because even in Formula One, I don't think airflow typically comes down the hill towards the wing and then goes back up. It looks like it may be trying to feed airflow in from the underside of the active aerodynamics housing, but that's really blocked up with all of the actuator gubbins, so I'm not entirely sure how this device works. But when you start looking at the complexities and the different designs on these cars, understanding on how they work can get quite difficult, because you can't just look at an aerodynamic component on a racing car and says it does this. So you can imagine it gets a little bit difficult when you start to look at some of the more complicated designs on display. Which brings me really neatly to this piece of, well, artistry. It's just complete design wizardry. This is the rear end of the Mercedes and their version of an active aerodynamics actuator. And when you see something this complicated, this beautiful, this piece of artistry, sometimes you just have to ask yourself, I don't have a clue what's going on with this, and I need to summon some help with this. You never stop learning in motor racing, and if you think you have, you're wrong. And when I need to do some really serious learning in Formula One, particularly about the technology and design of the cars, I summon the professor. And I don't know how to do that because this isn't the Wizard of Oz. I can click my fingers, click my heels, or I could just go, Willem!
Hello!
I'm joined here by Professor Willem Tot, who has, well, more experience and more knowledge than I could ever hope to acquire. Willem, what is going on with this? This is beautiful, isn't it?
It's absolutely gorgeous. As an aerodynamicist, when you're given these little windows of opportunity, it's lovely to be able to take advantage, and they've taken full advantage. So you've got here, and the beauty, I think, of it is that you can see the shapes of the aerofoil sections that they're using. So if you pick an individual shape, each one is an aerofoil, and they're multi-element stacks. So a single element above a three element, followed by a dual element, followed by a dual element. The last element here is, as the trailing edge of it is beyond vertical. So that element, which will have positive pressure on the front face and negative pressure on the rear face, that element in itself will produce lift. But it's part of a complete assembly that is changing the airflow distribution around this entire wing. And when you add an element, so if you have a multi-element wing and you just add an additional element like you see on many of the other cars, that does what we call pressure pumping. It pumps down the pressure underneath the main array of wings. So I've had a look at this today and done a quick hand calculation, and I think at top speed at Monaco on this little assembly, it's quite narrow, but there's quite a lot of elements there, 30 to 35 kilograms of downforce it'll produce at top speed. Now at lower speeds, when you're cornering, a bit less, but it's significant. But that's the direct effect. The indirect effect is you're probably going to reduce a little bit the pressures on the upper surface, so you get a little loss there, but you get a significant gain on the underside of the main assembly, a smaller gain on the little brace, they call it, for the rear wing, and a decent gain on the floor of the car. So my expectation, based on a lot of experience, I think, is probably a couple of 100 kilos of downforce are being added to the car by the presence of this device.
For those listening...
These are spectacular things.
They absolutely are. For those listening in countries that don't use modern measurement systems, that's two of me sitting on the rear wing, essentially. That's incredible amount of load.
Effectively.
That's a huge amount of load from what is quite a... Well, it looks like something from a science fiction novel, doesn't it? But it's really narrow, isn't it? It's about 50 millimetres wide.
About 50 mil wide.
Yeah, so that's less than, it's 5 centimetres.
So the plan area, because when you're doing a hand calculation, you need to revert to aircraft technologies or aircraft terminologies, and they will look at how big is it, how long is each element, you add those together. So they're quite narrow, but there's a lot of elements added together.
Willem, thank you very much for that insight into this quite mind-boggling piece of design from the Mercedes team, but there's a huge amount of mind-boggling design up and down the grid in Formula One, particularly this year at Monaco. Thanks for watching, because this has been one of the most fascinating episodes of Tech Talk ever, and I didn't even get to talk about all the lovely stuff on the Audi that I really wanted to, so we'll do that in future. Thanks for watching.